on today's Story Beat.
I think I learned a really, really important lesson, in terms of audiences. Always give your audience what they expect or what they can manage or, their perception, play to their perception, to their point of view, and not your point of view and what you want to do. You've always got to think about your audience and think about their expectations and their kind of enjoyment of your sort of entertainment product, if you like.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Max Kinnings, has written the feature films Act of Grace, Alleycats, and The Pagan King, as well as various film projects currently in development, including a film adaptation of his critically acclaimed play, Wireless Operator. He's the author of 4 novels, Hitman, The Fixer, Sacrifice, and Baptism. I've read Baptism and can tell you it's a tremendously exciting thriller in the vein of Lee Child, John Grisham, Dan Brown, John le Carre, and many other great novelists. Max is also the ghostwriter of comedian and actor Rik Mayall's best-selling spoof autobiography, Bigger Than Hitler, Better Than Christ. Max's work will form the basis of a 1-hour documentary he's writing and presenting on BBC Radio 4, due for broadcast in June 2024, which is the 10th anniversary of Rik Mayall's passing. Max was part of the writing team for the award-winning Sony PlayStation game Little Big Planet 3. Prior to his writing career, Max spent 12 years devising advertising and marketing campaigns for music festivals, tours, comedy shows, and West End theater productions. He holds a PhD in creative writing from Brunel University, London, where he also teaches. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my distinct privilege to welcome the brilliant playwright, screenwriter, and novelist Max Kinnings to StoryBeat today. Max, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks a lot, Steve. It's great to be here, and thanks for that lovely introduction. It was sounded sort of impressive. Quite taken aback. Thank you for that.
I'm just going to guess you may know a thing or two. That's what we're going to find out.
Yeah, well, let's find out, and I hope I do. Yeah.
Indeed. So let's go back in time just a little bit. Where did this idea of telling stories and writing them down and being a storyteller in written form, where did that begin? At what age did you start to think about that?
It started really young, actually. I loved reading. My mum was an English teacher, and she got myself and my brother reading very young. So I kind of loved the process. I'd always got my, head stuck in a book. I became sort of intrigued in the idea of actually, creating a book. So I remember I must have been only about sort of 7 or 8.
And you were thinking about writing books at 7 or 8?
Yeah, I know it sounds kind of ridiculous, but I'd started scribbling in this old sort of notebook. I think it was like an old ledger that my dad had brought home from his office or whatever. And I just loved this sort of hardback book. And I just loved the process of filling the pages with stuff that I'd written. And it all got a little bit kind of horrific. I was obsessed with horror and all the old sort of Universal Pictures movies, the old sort of Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, kind of Frankenstein, Dracula stories. And I'd always want to stay up late. We used to, on BBC Two on Friday and Saturday nights when I was little, they would sometimes show some of these old horror movies. And I'd always, sort of plead with my parents to be allowed to stay up late. And sometimes they'd go out and our babysitter would maybe have a couple of sherries and fall asleep. And we'd sort of flip over the TV and we'd get onto one of these old horror movies. And I became obsessed with that. And I think when I first started scribbling in this notebook, I was trying to sort of recreate this sort of scary sense of dread and doom that I'd seen in these old horror movies that I loved. So yeah, it's quite young.
Do you ever go back and look at that old writing and think to yourself, well, this is where I came from?
Sadly, I don't think no, I still haven't got it. It's lost to the mists of time somewhere and various house moves and whatever. I wish I did. I have all my old sort of notebooks going back about 30 years. So I've got a lot of stuff, first draft material in sort of scribbled form, yeah, in a load of notebooks lying around somewhere.
So you have written in many different forms. You've written as a playwright, a screenwriter, a novelist, and so on. Do you have a professional preference as to which of those three you prefer?
Well, it all depends what I've been doing recently. So if I've been working on a screenplay with somebody else and I've been collaborating on something, maybe working with a producer or working with another writer or writers, I will then love to start writing a novel, and that sort of solitary process, bashing out the first draft and then polishing it and editing it and whatever. So, but then again, if I've been doing that for a while, I then kind of like the idea of collaboration. So it kind of depends on what I've been doing. In terms of if you ask me if I had a favorite, it's a difficult one. I love the solitary process of writing a novel. I really do. And there's something, you stand or fall. You're on your own. It's you and maybe, your agent or your editor or the publishers, if you've been commissioned in advance. But generally, you are on your own. You stand or fall on what you do on the page. But I love the collaborative process of, writing a film and also working on a play. I mean, you mentioned that I was a playwright. I've written two plays that have been produced, and I kind of fell into that really by other people saying, we've got an idea. Do you want to write it with us? So I sort of, just fell into playwriting. But I do love the process of screenwriting and writing in a partnership. When I was working with Rik Mayall on his spoof autobiography, that was very much a sort of partnership. And I've done ghostwriting I've ghostwritten a couple of novels as well. And there's a kind of alchemy I think you get, particularly when you're writing comedic material, when you have that partnership.
Sure.
I do love that. Actually, that process is absolutely fascinating.
Well, comedy really kind of needs that bounce back from somebody else, or you're maybe not 100% sure it works until you get it in front of an audience.
Yes.
And that's a little late in the game to be testing it.
But this is it. And your collaborator becomes your sort of prototype audience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I love that. If it makes you both laugh, it's in. If it makes one of you laugh, you've got to persuade the other one that it's funny, and then it's in. And if you can't, it's out. So yeah.
I've long said that the only definition there is of comedy is, does it make you laugh? Yes or no?
Yeah.
If it makes you laugh, it's comedy. If it doesn't, it isn't.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah.
So was there a point where you thought to yourself, I am really good at this writing thing and maybe I'd like to make it my career?
Not really. I mean, I'd sort of, as I mentioned, I sort of wrote as a little kid, I just scribbled things in a notebook because it just sort of appealed to me. And I came, and I enjoyed writing, creative writing at school, if we did that in class. But, when teenage time arrived, I mean, you can see over my shoulder, I've got a guitar there in the room. I became really interested in music. And, for many years, I kind of fancied myself a bit of a sort of proto rock star. It was never going to happen. I didn't have the talent or the kind of drive really in that direction. But I had a band at school. I like posing in front of, our sixth form bar at school and showing off and, and all that sort of stuff. And I moved down to London when I was 18 to go to college. And I really thought that I was going to sort of make my mark as the sort of, I don't know, the new Joe Strummer, from The Clash or something like that. He's my hero of the time. And that never happened. But I did end up working in the music industry doing advertising and marketing. And it was kind of around that time, I guess it must have been in my early 20s, that I really was sort of kind of looking around subconsciously as much as consciously. I think probably subconsciously more than anything. I was sort of looking for a kind of creative outlet. And it was then that during my time as a student, I'd really immersed myself in, I mean, I didn't study literature. I studied a social science degree. I was studying criminology and psychology. But through that, I got a real sort of fascination for literature. And actually, American literature, I got heavily into the beats, Kerouac and Burroughs and Ginsberg and all these sort of writers, and Hunter S. Thompson in particular. And I kind of love that kind of Gonzo style of writing. And that really, really appealed to me. And I think that kind of plugged into my interest in the music press. I was a big, that, you know, obviously being interested in music, I read a lot of the music press, and I think it was Thompson, you know, and his sort of Gonzo writing in Rolling Stone and all of that that really got me into reading literature. And it was sort of off the back of that that I thought, well, you know, with the typical arrogance of a young writer starting out, I thought, how hard can it be? You know, come on, I can have a go at that. And then obviously realized that it actually was incredibly difficult. But I kind of love the process, actually. You just enjoy getting the material down, even if it's not really going anywhere. If you enjoy that process, then, you know, you're going to get better, I guess. You're going to practice and you're going to get better.
So my students, and you probably can say the same about yours, they come in and frequently they think that it's easy because they've seen television shows or plays or they've read a book or two, and they think that doesn't look that hard to do.
Yeah.
So I can do that. Anybody can do that. And then in fact, you give them an assignment and they go, uh-oh, this is actually really hard to do.
Yes, this is it. And what they don't factor in is that they think that writers sort of sit there, write a first draft, and the first draft is the last draft.
Oh, sure.
And that's, you know, that it all comes out in one, you know, all like fully full.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that always sort of, I think, is quite a shock to students. It's certainly a shock to me when I started writing.
I think of first drafts as you're actually forming the clay that you're going to sculpt.
Yeah.
And that after that is when the actual art takes place. It's after the first draft.
So, right. I don't know who said it, you might know, but somebody, famous writer, said, you know, all writing is rewriting. And it's just so true.
It is true that the craft is in the original drafting and in understanding how the mechanics of it work and so on. That's the craft of writing, but the art is in the revisions.
Yeah, that's it.
I'm fascinated that you said that you're influenced by the Gonzo writers, especially Hunter S. Thompson and Burroughs and so on, because you write more of meat and potatoes, not so much in the Gonzo style. But you know what? Now that I think about it, reading your work, that sort of is in there too. It's just you've got it played into your more genre style of writing.
Well, this is it, Nacy. You've read Baptism, which is, so when Baptism came along, so that was about 2012, I think that was published. And back in about 2000, 2001, I had a couple of books published then. There was one called Hitman and there was one called The Fixer. And they were much more satirical, much more experimental, and much more, particularly Hitman, my first novel, was much more kind of gonzo. And it was very much the idea of the kind of picaresque kind of outlaw kind of characters living on the edge, living on the margins of society, taking drugs, living a very dissolute lifestyle. In Hitman, it was kind of a reflection of the music industry in London in the 90s that I'd kind of lived through and worked through. And I wanted to try and capture that through a kind of neo-beat lens. So Hitman, my first published novel, I'd actually written a couple previously to that hadn't got anywhere. That was very much, you know, this kind of freewheeling, present tense, first person kind of gonzo style. I've been working in the music industry for many years and sort of doing the advertising and marketing for not just music, but also comedy and theatre as well. And I've been doing pretty well. I mean, my career was going well, but looking back on it now, I can see that I was kind of pressing the self-destruct button, you know, in terms of that career. You know, I'd take 6 months off and go backpacking around India and Thailand because I wanted to write, you know, a sort of travel log. And I was doing everything that was really in readiness for trying to be a writer until finally I kind of, you know, gradually started packing it all in and sort of moving on from my career in marketing and advertising into sort of writing full time once I had my first two novels published in, I think, sort of 2000, 2001. So, but yeah, it was very much that kind of gonzo styling, that kind of American style, that freewheeling kind of stream of consciousness, which I really got turned on to in terms of writing when I first started out.
Which is very much not what you wrote in Baptism, which is not freewheeling.
Which is very much not, because what happened was I'd written Hitman and that had got some great reviews, you know, sort of quite a lot of critical acclaim. And that was very much sort of, my reflection on the music industry. And it was like satirizing the sort of druggy subculture that had been reflected in the novels of people like Irvine Welsh. And I was kind of satirizing that. It was deliberately, comedic in the vein of Welsh. And then my second book, it was a two-book deal. My second book was The Fixer. And it came about, my sort of conception of it came about around the time of reality TV. We had Big Brother over here, the reality TV show.
Sure.
I think that first aired in about 99. So that was when I was writing this book. And, I was working with a lot of show business agents and show business managers. I just thought, how funny would it be, or how kind of satirical and kind of topical would it be to have a show business agent managing a serial killer as though they're a celebrity, and bringing that same sort of knowledge and understanding of the market and the media and the public's tastes. Because I remember back in the sort of 90s, there was some big serial killing cases over here. There was Fred and Rose West, who were in Gloucester, and they'd some horrific crimes were going on there. And then we had a doctor called Dr. Harold Shipman, and he'd killed literally hundreds, I think.
Wow.
And I noticed this thing. I think he killed something like 250 with morphine, that he just,
right,
as though he was helping these patients of his, he was basically finishing them off. And unfortunately, nobody ever really got to the bottom of why he was doing it, because he committed suicide in his cell before he actually came to trial. So the whole thing's still a mystery. But I noticed that there was this kind of hunger in the media. And I was working, in the media, obviously, as a media buyer. So I had to have an understanding of all the newspapers and all the TV programs and their audiences. But I noticed in the sort of audience expectation of these serial killer stories, it was almost like there was a hunger for the news to be even more, not just sort of explicit and specific about the crimes, but it's also like a sort of tally of the dead. So it was like Harold Shipman's killed over 200. Could that make him the world's worst ever serial killer? It was like, hey, we've got the record. It was that kind of weird psychology that the sort of the public had to almost celebrate in a weird kind of way.
It's almost like it's a game.
Exactly. It's almost like it's a game. And so I thought, well, I'm going to satirize that. That was The Fixer. And so those first two books were very satirical and very comedic. And I was writing my third book in a similar vein of this sort of satirical, sort of comedic look at the media and popular culture. And then 9/11 came along.
Mm.
And in fact, The Fixer, I think, was published literally days before 9/11 took place. And suddenly it had a profound effect on me, as it did, obviously, for people all over the world. It had a really profound effect in that suddenly I was thinking, and I was also doing marketing for sort of comedy shows at the time and working with comedy agents and comedy producers. And suddenly it felt like comedy couldn't address this thing that was so massive. There was such a sort of cataclysmic sort of, not just physical event, but sort of cultural and psychological event and kind of wound in the public consciousness. It felt like comedy couldn't kind of get there. It couldn't kind of quite reach it. And suddenly I felt that writing comedy, writing this third book, this sort of follow-up, I kind of slightly lost interest in it. And it almost felt like writing comedy was a kind of flippant thing. I decided that I wanted to write something that was reflective of this terrifying new phenomenon of terrorism in the world that had been brought about through 9/11. And obviously in 2005, we had, terrorism came to London.
Sure.
In the form of 7/7, 7th of July, 2005. And that really kind of spurred me on. I'd been toying around with doing a bit of screenwriting, and I was still working in the media at that time. And I was trying to finish this third novel, and it didn't really happen. And then I happened on this idea, creating a character of Ed Mallory, as you know, who's in the novel Baptism, who's a hostage negotiator. And it was through that I became really interested in the whole idea of reflecting the nature of terrorism as that was taking place within London.
But you gave him an interesting twist because he's blind.
Well, this is it. So I wrote a version of Baptism where he wasn't blind. And I wrote this book, and weirdly, that book is actually published in Holland. I got a deal in Holland, and it's called Claustrophobia, and it's a different version of Baptism. And he's a much more kind of derivative, typical kind of big drinking, kind of dissolute sort of character. I don't know if you remember a TV show that was produced over here called Cracker. It was Robbie Coltrane.
I've heard the name, but I don't think I've seen it.
He's a sort of psychological profiler, and I love the idea of somebody who can sort of psychologically profile people. I'd come up with this story, and maybe I'll talk a little bit how I came up with the story of Baptism a little bit in a minute. But I came up with this character, and that's very much my creative process, is I come up with characters first. There's that age-old sort of question, is it plot or character that comes first? And I'm very much of the character school. So I came up with this character, Fred Mallory, this hostage negotiator. And as I say, this book was published in Holland, but I couldn't get a deal in the UK. I changed agents around that time because I just couldn't get it away, and I just wanted a fresh pair of eyes on it, really, as much as anything. And my new agent looked at it and said, "Look, I think the issue is your central character. I think you've got a great plot, you've got a great storyline. You've got this terrorist hijack on the London Underground. It's like the taking of Pelham 123." Kind of, updated for the noughties, and, the kind of storyline was there, but the central character was too derivative. So he said, why don't you go away and think about what you could do with this central character? So I was sort of, thinking hard about how I could change this character. And at the time, I was working, I used to go up to the British Library up on Euston Road in London. From South London, because my wife and I had just had a baby girl, and it was all pretty chaotic at home. And in order to write, I would get on the tube and I would go up to North London, to Euston Road, to the British Library, which is this wonderful, wonderful library in this, great sort of atmosphere of learning. And I used to really love going up there to work. And very close to the British Library is the Royal National Institute for the Blind. Often sort of blind people would be getting off the tube, as I would be, and sometimes I'd offer an arm, just to help them up the escalator or whatever, and through the sort of ticket barriers and everything, and then walk with them to the Royal Institute for the Blind, which was right by the British Library. And I was doing this one day, and it was just around the time that I was trying to think of this new character, Fred Mallory, and the light bulb went on. It was like, this idea of you lose one sense and the other senses become much more attuned and much more sensitive. I was thinking, so I've got this hostage negotiator. So, one of the things that you learn about when you research hostage negotiation is this concept of active listening. So you're listening to someone, and, as you're doing so, you're sort of psychologically profiling them. And then I was thinking, so, if this character doesn't, they've lost their sense of sight, would that enhance their active listening? Now, nobody has told me that clinically or medically that is a fact, but I kind of, with a bit of artistic license, I took that to be the case.
I think it probably is the case.
I think it probably is, but I don't know as a fact. And I just thought, okay, I'm going to create a backstory for this guy, that he oversteps the mark in a hostage negotiation. It all goes horribly wrong. He is blinded whilst on duty. And then he comes back, and continues his job, but with this new sort of almost like kind of superpower, if you like, that he's born out of his blindness. And I also kind of like the idea of having a central character in a sort of commercial thriller who is disabled and has this very sort of different sort of take on the world, and he's still trying to come to terms with his disability and all these sorts of things. And it just made it a much more interesting central character. So I rewrote the book. I didn't change the plot very much. Obviously, I sort of wrote in his origin story of how he became blind, threaded this new character through the story. And, whereas before I, just couldn't get a deal, suddenly publishers were interested.
Hmm.
Because of this new character, because he was different, he was unusual. He sort of people sort of seemed to could identify with him more closely than just the sort of slightly stereotypical.
Well, we love characters that have to overcome difficulties and obstacles and conflict and challenges.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to put roadblocks in a character's way, it's an entire thing differently if the character themselves has the roadblock inside of them.
Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely. No, this is it. And so Ed Mallory became, not only has he got this, issue with his lack of sight, but also he's got this issue with not being able to come to terms with it. So, he doesn't want to use a white stick. He doesn't want to, he doesn't want to get a guide dog. He doesn't want to do all the things that you would normally expect somebody would want to do because he doesn't want to admit to himself because he hasn't come to terms with it. So yes, he's throwing up these obstacles over and above the sort of physical obstacles.
And he has people within the police force who already know who he is and don't like him.
Yes, that's right. Yes, he's known as a difficult character. And that's right. And people who, he's awkward and he's someone who is, yeah, he's a difficult guy to get on with.
So I'm curious, how did you know as much as you know about police procedures? And, how did you know about the tube and how all that works? How much research did you need to do?
Okay, so the tube, I was always obsessed with the tube. Ever since I was a little kid and I came down to London, I came from a very small, quiet country market town in the Midlands, in the West Midlands called Shrewsbury. And coming down to London with my mum and dad was just incredibly exciting. And the most exciting part of coming down to London for me was to go on the London Underground. These incredibly deep tunnels, very narrow, quite claustrophobic, still very much with their sort of Victorian architecture and some of their sort of Art Deco architecture from the 1920s or whatever, old and dark, and they had this very, very specific smell. I mean, people used to be able to smoke in those days, back in the 70s and 80s on the underground, and there'd be this sort of smell of kind of it was like being on the waltzers at a fairground. You'd have that smell of electricity and the smell of the fumes of the engines, and you'd have the smell of the cigarettes. And I found it totally intoxicating. And I've always been fascinated by the London Underground. But I was also, even from when I first moved to London when I was 18, I remember thinking to myself, it's such a target. I mean, obviously, we had the sort of bombing campaign of the IRA in the 1970s and 80s in London. And,
right.
And there was always a fear that the tube was this soft target for terrorists. And I always remember thinking to myself, it would be, I think, probably from watching To the Taking of Pelham 123, which is a favorite movie of mine.
Mine too.
Yeah, no, it's a great movie. And I remember thinking, God, it'd be really easy to take one of these trains. Back in the day, they'd have a guard and they'd have a driver. Nowadays, they just have a driver. There's no guard. But, I just remember thinking it'd be so easy to take a train. And I think this idea had sort of stayed with me for years and years and years, so that when I was thinking about, writing a commercial thriller, leaving behind the kind of Gonzo satirical comedy thing behind and actually writing a commercial thriller that kind of plugged into the sort of fear of terrorism and everything. I just thought, yeah, it's got to be the London Underground, because it's something I've always been fascinated with. But I also had to do a lot of research. And yes, I did research into the police, but I did more research really into the London Underground and driving, train drivers and the whole process of that. And I went along, there's a little museum. There's the London Museum of Transport, it's called, in Covent Garden. They have a little library there. And I went along there and they kind of befriended me, and they put me in touch. There was like a message board for London Underground staff, and they let me join that, and I spoke to drivers. And then one day they said to me, oh, we can let you meet a driver on a train, and you can go up and down the Northern Line with this driver who's sort of off duty, and he'll answer some of your questions. And that was fascinating, talking about the London Underground and all of that. And I remember sitting there, and we were right hard up at the front of the train, right by the driver's door. And This driver that I was talking to was obviously off duty at the time. And I said to him, so, what is stopping me at this point breaking that bit of glass there? And if I've got like an Allen key, just a common and garden Allen key, I can open the door, I can get into that, into the driver's cab. What is stopping me doing that? And just as he was about to answer, the person I was with, who was from the press office, London Underground press office, closed down the conversation and said, "No, stop." And it made me realize, my God, this is something they've obviously thought about and are aware of. That was really very telling to me that it is a kind of soft target. And I don't want to frighten your listeners who visit London and travel on the Underground, but it was something that again, it was this sort of feeling of, my God, this is something that hasn't really been explored before, certainly through fiction. So yeah, I did quite a bit of research about the tube and the drivers and the whole process and the signal system and all of that, because I felt that it kind of needed that. It needed that kind of texture of realism so that the reader could really kind of, buy into the reality of that.
I don't think today you can write a book like Baptism without it feeling raw and right in your face. I don't think that's possible to succeed unless a reader feels like they're right there.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's talk about how you get to a book. That is to say, you have an idea, you want to do something in the tube, you want it to be about terrorism. So where do you begin? You say you start with characters, I get that, but then do you sit down and plot it out? Do you outline it? Do you know what you're doing before you start?
I did. Yeah, very much so. So I wrote my first two books pretty much without outlining. And it was only really by starting screenwriting. I had a bit of interest from a couple of sort of independent producers in my first two books. And I got to know someone whose books were published about the same time, who's a screenwriter, a good friend of mine who I've written with in the past, a guy called Mark Pye. And, Mark was like my mentor in terms of screenwriting. And so he suggested various books that I should read. He'd written a lot of television by that stage. And so I started reading, about the process of screenwriting, not novel writing, but screenwriting.
Right.
And obviously outlining is so sort of important for the process of screenwriting. And so suddenly it was like, yeah, I'm not just going to write, my way into a story as I had done in the past. I want to write an outline for this story. And I actually outlined Baptism initially as a film. So I had this outline, and I had it, it was a big sort of Excel spreadsheet where I had, because obviously each of the chapters has got a time code. And so some of those chapters are kind of overlapping. So you're seeing the same events from different perspectives and different points of view. So I outlined it exhaustively. Having never really outlined it, I suddenly became a massive convert and sort of evangelical for outlining. But I have to go back a little because there was something that happened to me. I'd come up with the idea of Ed Mallory as this character, of this hostage negotiator character. And I was actually thinking of another story where the Home Secretary of the British government is kidnapped. And I was beginning to develop that story when 7/7, the terrorist attack on the London Underground, took place. And everybody can remember 7/7 because obviously it was the appalling bombing campaign and terrible loss of life. What a lot of people can't remember now is that exactly 2 weeks after 7/7, so this was the 21st of July 2005, another 4 bombers tried to set off their explosives on the London Underground and repeat the same attack, but their explosives didn't go off, right? And they fled. So now at the time I was doing jury service at a court in central London, and I was traveling up from South London on the London Underground on the Northern Line, and it was very paranoid and very frightening because there were these 4 bombers that were on the loose. London was on high alert. There were police everywhere. You don't see armed police very often in London, but they were all tooled up, and it was a very, very scary time. And I was in the tube going up to do my jury service in the morning, the day after. So this is the 22nd of July, 2005. And suddenly the tube stopped. Now, often the tube stops for a couple of minutes, because of a signaling thing or whatever. This was a rush hour tube. It was busy. It was packed full of people. And it stopped. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, nothing. The driver comes over the intercom and says, we're stuck here. I've got a red light. I'm not getting any information from the signal office. Don't know what's going on, but I'll keep you updated. So went to about 6, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes. People are getting pretty frightened. I mean, everybody's sitting there with newspapers, which is the front page news is these terrorists are on the loose. Everybody's crammed in this tunnel, hundreds of feet underground. And I remember sitting there and I was a bit frightened. I think everybody was. And the thing I really noticed and remembered was how normally in London, people, especially the commuters, they're quite an unfriendly bunch. They don't really talk to each other. There's very little kind of camaraderie. There's people, they have their little kind of social bubble sort of around them. They're reading the papers or reading their books or nowadays looking at their tablets or their phones. And suddenly I noticed after about 10, 11, 12 minutes, that sort of kind of psychological facade began to drop away. And people started talking to each other. And I'd lived in London for years. I'd never seen this.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember people laughing nervously, this nervous laughter. And, the driver kept updating us and saying, look, I'm still not getting any news. And, I don't know what's happening. People getting increasingly frightened. Some people wanted to talk. Some people just wanted to sort of hibernate. They wanted to sort of, shut down and go into themselves and, almost sort of pull the newspapers around them. And I just remember thinking to myself, I'm a writer. This is frightening. And, I'm a coward by anybody's estimation, but I remember thinking, I've got to remember this. I've got to remember this feeling, this psychology of this tube train and this sense of fear and uncertainty. And, after nearly an hour, we were there for nearly an hour. So it was really, people were getting very tense. People were really getting very nervous. There were a few tears. They brought all the trains sort of bumper to bumper in the tunnel, and they evacuated us down the trains into the tube station that we just left.
Outside of the trains?
Yeah, no, in the trains. They put them all together, and we walked literally the full length of these trains.
Inside the trains?
Inside the trains.
Got it.
And we walked all the way back through all these trains that they pulled.
Oh my goodness.
Back to the platform. And it was a tragedy because the police had mistaken this Brazilian electrician called Jean-Charles de Menezes. They'd mistaken him for one of the bombers, and they'd killed him. They'd shot him in the next train up from ours, the train ahead, right? They thought he was going to let off. He had a bag with him. They thought he was going to let off some explosives, and they shot him. But at the time, we didn't know this. This only became common knowledge later in the day. And at the time, everyone thought that they killed one of the bombers, and there was this really frightening kind of gung-ho spirit that all these kind of commuters had of like, good, we got him. We got one of them, and it was real kind of bloodlust. And again, I saw this sort of psychology of these people, and it was like, my God, this is something I've got to try and kind of latch onto, as a writer and try and explore. So that was a really formative experience for me, very frightening experience, but something that made me think, right, I've got this character, but I haven't got the right setting for him. And that plugged into my fascination that I'd always had for the London Underground. And I had this experience, which was very frightening. And, and I felt a sense of anger almost against these people, and I wanted to explore that world. So that is how baptism came about, through this sort of personal experience, but then also the psychology of this central character. And that's when I really started, mapping it out and outlining it meticulously.
How many pages was your outline?
Well, my outline was, long, about 30, 40 pages, sort of, and then I also had this I had this Excel sheet where I could drag things around in time, because it became very complex because, as I say, I would have certain incidents would be seen from different points of view overlapping in time. And so my time codes weren't always fitting, so as they should. And so it became, there were points where I was thinking to myself, why have I done something as complex as this? You know, I wish I'd kept it more simple. It was really making my brain ache.
But it's also a mystery, so it has to have some complexity to it.
This is it. Yeah, this is it. And I kind of like, I don't know, I kind of like that kind of immediacy. I've always liked stories that take place over a very short period of time.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know why that is. But yeah, I like the fact of seeing an event play out and seeing it through different eyes and different perceptions and different points of view. And to some people, it's not a big deal. Other people, it's utterly terrifying. And just seeing this same event through these different lenses, I think. I mean, I love writing, stories which are just from one point of view. I've written three novels just in the first person, so I kind of love that, but I also love this idea of seeing one event through multiple points of view.
Well, and I think you've done that quite brilliantly there. I'm also curious. You said that you originally wrote Baptism, or you thought about writing it as a screenplay.
Yes.
And you've also been a screenwriter. You're a screenwriter and you teach screenwriting.
Yeah.
And I'm quite curious, are you planning to take Baptism and turn it into a movie somehow?
It's been a long, you know what it's like. These things
I
take a
do.
long, long time, and
Yes, they
so
do.
for many years it was optioned to an independent company over here, and we even did a spec trailer for it, which you can see on YouTube. We sort of spent a weekend on a tube carriage in a big marquee, sort of shooting this spec trailer, which with the producers then you tried to use to get other financiers and producers involved. Then during lockdown, I wrote it as a sort of four-part mini series, and it's still out there. It's still, I'm still trying to get it away. So yeah, it's something I've sort of adapted it as a movie and a mini series, and it's a work in progress.
I think it would make a terrific, it's very visual the way you've written it. So I think it would make a terrific motion picture of some kind, whether it's a series or a single movie or whatever it is. It will be not cheap to make, I don't think, because of the
No.
location of it. It's underground in the tube. And while you can build sets and make some of that happen, some of it you really have to go out in the world and do.
Absolutely. No, I think it would, and maybe it's that. I think that it would be quite expensive, but yeah, thank you.
Are you very much into, in your other books, action or some kind of actiony kind of storytelling? That's what it seems like you're great at.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I wrote a sequel to Baptism called Sacrifice, which is the same Ed Mallory character. And again, it's very similar. It takes place over one day. It's multiple points of view. It's very violent. There's a sort of there's a political scene to it, as there is in Baptism. But it was funny. I had this intention to write a series of novels, and it never really happened. I kind of enjoyed the process of writing Baptism and Sacrifice, but it felt like I'd sort of got that out of my system.
Mm.
And then at the same time, I was writing a thriller called Alleycats, which was a sort of low budget thriller set around the sort of underground bike racing scene in central London. And so I wrote that as a thriller, and I had my first movie that I'd co-written was also a thriller. And I think I got to a point where I sort of felt that I was all a bit actioned out. I'd kind of, I'd sort of enjoyed the process and I loved writing it, but I wanted to go and do something else. And I think that's it, that I kind of not lose interest, but I once I worked in one area a lot, whether it's, screenwriting or novel writing, I'm sort of keen to get into another area. I enjoy sort of moving around a little bit. And so as much as I enjoyed writing those thrillers, I decided that I was going to try something else. So I wrote a historical action movie set in Latvia in the 10th century, which was a fascinating process. And that was just a kind of paid gig that I got, but I loved it.
Yeah, not too many people sitting around thinking to themselves, you know what, I'll write something in the 10th century. Oh, and by the way, let's put it in Latvia.
Well, this is it. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I was approached by a Latvian production company for which this story was that, like, it's their national legend.
Ah,
So and I felt a lot of responsibility on my shoulders, to work on that.
well, yeah, because you'll have a whole country down on you if you don't get it right.
Exactly. I didn't want to get it wrong. So yeah, I was just kind of jumping around, and funnily enough, the book that I'm writing now, that I'm working on at the moment, is a return to the kind of baptism, sacrifice. It's not the same universe, it's not the same central character of the negotiator, but it's that same, multiple points of view over a 24-hour period.
Do you, when you're writing, do like I do, which is I actually see the movie playing out in my mind's eye, and then I feel like I'm a reporter, almost a journalist, and I'm reporting from the field what I'm seeing in my mind. Is it the same for you?
Totally. Yeah, and I think that's it. And I think if you've got that sensibility of a screenwriter alongside being a novelist, I think novelists do it anyway, obviously. But yeah, completely. I completely see it playing out.
Well, there are novelists that write purely emotional things.
That's
It's
true.
not action at all. It's not genre at all. It's very much internal, or it's very much feelings, or simply interactions between people, and it's not full of movement. And it's the same
Yes.
thing with
Yeah.
playwriting. Playwriting is an entirely different beast, sort of the same thing, but quite different in the sense that you're having characters talking to each other endlessly, potentially throughout the course of a whole show. I mean, my favorite play of all plays is Waiting for Godot, and it doesn't really go anywhere.
Right.
That's why you've never seen Waiting for Godot as a movie, because it doesn't move forward. It just keeps talking
Yeah.
and talking and talking, which I think is phenomenal, but wouldn't make a very good motion picture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting you should mention Waiting for Godot, because I'm working on this documentary, this radio documentary about Rik Mayall, who I think in terms of an American audience, you'd probably know him from The Young Ones, which I think played on MTV, and also Drop Dead Fred and things like that. But he was a lifelong Beckett fan, and actually did Waiting for Godot in the West End of London in 1991,
Mm,
which weirdly I'd
mm.
done the advertising for when I worked in media. And yeah, I mean, that's just a wonderful piece. And
But that's a real difference between a play, which can go vertically,
yeah,
versus a movie that has to move horizontally. It's got to move forward, or it dies like a shark.
yes, absolutely.
It has to move forward.
It has to move forward. There has to be that momentum, that kind of kinetic momentum. But even within that, I've become sort of fascinated in projects that kind of, film projects that kind of break that paradigm.
Like what?
Well, sort of, so Buried, is it the Ryan Reynolds movie?
Sure.
The entire movie takes place in a coffin buried in the desert.
Indeed.
There's a Tom Hardy movie that Stephen Knight wrote called Locke.
I've seen it.
Yeah, and I kind of like, I know exactly what you mean by, you need that kinetic momentum, but I actually admire those filmmakers who try and sort of break the paradigm and try and do something very different within the form.
So I think they try to move the emotion forward
Yes.
so that it's still moving forward, as opposed to Waiting for Godot, where they talk and talk and talk and talk.
Yeah.
And yet you're getting the entire universe in the play,
Yes.
but it doesn't really move forward. They remain in one place the whole time. Nothing goes forward.
Nothing happens. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And that's why it's so wonderful, because you just get lost in the language of it.
So what for you makes great dialogue great?
Well, blimey, that's a big question. I think it needs to, it's character, isn't it? I mean, it's got to be true to the character, and it's got to be that kind of interaction and that kind of interplay between two or more characters, or even one character, speaking to themselves, I guess. But yeah, it's that sort of believability. One of the things I notice, teaching creative writing, is that students very often, starting out in the world of writing, overwrite dialogue. They always overwrite. They put too much in, and particularly in screenwriting, they don't tell the story visually enough. They try and tell it. They try and deliver all the exposition through dialogue, and that always seems to be a fundamental issue.
Sure. It's called a movie. It's supposed to move, not talk.
Exactly. And I think, I don't know, you have these wonderful stylists, like Tarantino, and you could just listen to the dialogue for hours. Although I think he sometimes overplays it, but it maybe needed a bit of an editor there. But who's going to?
But he's an iconoclast and he can get away with it, just like the Coen brothers can get away with it.
Exactly.
And what I see sometimes in young people, like you're talking about, is they see and admire and get real up on someone like a Tarantino or the Coen brothers. And so they try to emulate them in some way
Yes,
poorly. And
poorly.
they're masters, and it took them a long time to get to that point where they couldn't have that kind of dialogue, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. And this is it. And sometimes you need to overwrite. I'm a firm believer in overwriting, particularly in terms of dialogue.
Sure.
Just writing way too much, and then remembering that old adage, of arrive late, leave early, in terms of a scene. So you might have a load of dialogue, but actually so much of it you can just cut away and find the sort of beats that you're looking for within the drama and just focus on those.
I teach and I believe in, and it's not my concept, though I totally believe in it, that if it doesn't move the story forward or expand our understanding of the character, you cut it.
Absolutely.
And then you get down to as fat free as you can in your storytelling with both dialogue and action.
This is it, and I'm a firm believer in that. And I think that's what I learned from screenwriting. I mean, I think I learned more about sort of novel writing and story structure and narrative generally from studying screenwriting, where every second has to count, through a sort
Indeed.
of economic imperative as much as anything. And I think that's right. And I try and bring that kind of mindset of the screenwriter to the world of novel writing because yeah, absolutely, if it's not doing anything, it's just sort of idling there on the page with no reason to be there. It's got to go.
The worst thing is when a writer writes, "Hello, hi, how are you? It's
Yes.
great to see you." I mean, nobody cares. That's why you cut right on in on what the heart of the matter is.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, what is your thinking in terms of the best way to pitch a story to either a producer or a publisher? How do you go about pitching yourself so that the story is sellable?
Well, it's one of those things that it's really difficult because if you're constantly sort of second guessing what the market is sort of looking for, filmmaking and novel writing, you're always going to be kind of slightly out of date because as soon as you're seeing something that you feel is where the market's going, by the time you've spent the whatever it is, 2, 3 years writing a novel, or 2, 3 years sort of maybe developing a screenplay with producers or whatever, that thing that was the zeitgeist, or you thought was the zeitgeist, has moved on.
Oh, indeed.
So I think it's dangerous, isn't it, to try and second guess the market. My thinking, my mindset in terms of sort of pitching ideas and pitching projects is yes, it's useful to have an element of topicality to what you're writing, and you don't want to be writing, you don't want to be on the sort of tail end of a kind of fad or a scene. You don't want to be on the tail end of that. But I think you just have to pitch it in terms of a unique character. I think that's the key, actually, is the unique character, but, the telling of their story in a sort of unusual way. And I think, in terms of pitching, people, it's almost like they overpitch, I think, sometimes. They write too much. That's something that it's a weird irony of the creative industries that I've found, certainly in terms of publishing and filmmaking, is that it's all about the narrative. It's all about, starting off with the words on paper. But a lot of the executives and a lot of the people that you deal with, the publishers and the editors and the producers, they don't like reading. They're busy people. And they don't want a big wad of paper that they've got to plow through.
True.
They want to look at something that's going to pitch them the idea in half a page.
Absolutely true.
And that in itself is an art form. I know some great writers and they can construct wonderful stories and wonderful characters, but they can't write a pitch and like a really good log line, or they can't write a really nice sort of short synopsis that's going to really knock everyone up, out. They can't do it. It's a different mindset. It's actually much more to do with advertising and marketing and media, really. You're selling it, as an idea.
I think it was Abraham Lincoln who, and I'm paraphrasing it, of course, but I think he once said to someone, I apologize for the length of this letter. If I'd had more time, it would have been shorter.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's it. That is totally it. Yeah, because the more you edit, the more you get into that mindset, the shorter the thing will get. And it
And
gets
I think personally, short stories are the most difficult form to master. And then you can take it all the way down and say that haiku is the most difficult form of all.
yeah.
17 syllables, I believe it is, to tell whatever you're telling. That's hard to do well. I mean, you can do it, but it's hard to do really well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And one of the things through teaching screenwriting, I teach a short film class where the assessment is like a 10-minute short film. And I've become, having not really known a lot about short films many, many years, from when I first started, I love the short film form. I think it's wonderful. And I know a lot of, for example, Alleycats, the movie that I wrote, we wrote a short film for that as like a proof of concept that we, sent out to producers and we got work through that. I think it was through that process of writing that 10-minute short film script, I really got into the idea of telling short stories. And actually, I think the short film form is wonderful. It really is. The things you can do in just a few minutes in terms of characterization and narrative are absolutely fascinating.
Well, you were in advertising, and commercials are really tiny short stories.
Exactly. Exactly. This is it. And I think that it was coming from that background that kind of made me realize, if you're writing a commercial, and you've got 30 seconds and you can't go over that 30, so you can't be 31 seconds, and so I think it was probably that discipline that really, that I took forward into certainly into screenwriting for sure.
Indeed. So I have been having the most marvelous conversation for a little more than an hour now with Max Kinnings coming to us in Pittsburgh, all the way from London. And I'm going to wind the show down a little bit. So I'm wondering, in all of your experiences in the business of writing
Yeah.
or in movie making, are you able to share with us a story that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or maybe just plain funny?
Okay. When I was 5 years old, okay, so this might feel, oh, this isn't in the industry, but actually it's something that I've sort of taken with me into the industry. When I was about 5 years old, I was out in the garden at home after school, and I found some acorns. And I picked up this acorn, and I was a bit of a nerdy kid, sort of lost in my own little world. And I dismantled this acorn. Okay. And so, you'd got the stem and the cup of the acorn and the seed coat. And I managed to sort of, almost dissect this acorn. And I took off the seed coat and then I managed to put it all back together again. And I remember being very, very excited about this. And I thought, right, I'm going to take this into school in the morning. And they used to do show and tell, where you'd bring something in and you'd show it to the school. And so there I am the following day in front of a big sort of infant school, hundreds of sort of 5 and 6 year old kids and teachers and everything. And I'm thinking, I've got something really fascinating here. There it is in my the acorn that I've got with me, and sweaty in my little hand. And they said, oh, Max has got something that he wants to bring up for show and tell. So I walked up to the top of this school hall, stood there, and then it hit me that what I got in my hand, this little acorn that I was prepared to, dissect in front of the school, meant nothing to anybody because nobody could see it. It was absolutely tiny. Okay.
Right.
And I can remember it really clearly now, however many years later, thinking, oh my God, I've completely misjudged this. Nobody's going to be able to see it. Nobody's going to understand what I'm doing. I've completely blown it. Right. And so I had to sort of abandon ship and walk back. And I think I learned a really, really important lesson, in terms of audiences. Always, give your audience what they expect or what they can manage, or, their perception, play to their perception, to their point of view, and not your point of view and what you want to do. You've always got to think about your audience and think about their expectations and their kind of enjoyment of your sort of entertainment product, if you like. So, when I'm thinking of audiences, I'm transported back to my little 5-year-old self standing there with my my sort of dissected acorn at the end of the class in front of hundreds of people just looking at me thinking, what is he doing? And so I think that is, a kind of weird little story that kind of comes back to me every now and again, which has kind of informed a lot of my kind of writing and creativity.
Well, there's no doubt, even if you want to write for yourself, which I think you should to a certain extent,
yeah,
you still should consider the audience in the equation.
Yeah. And if they can't see your acorn from the back of the school hall, then you failed.
I think that's a very telling story. And a whole career has bloomed from that.
Yes, well, yeah, let's hope. Yeah, it will continue to do so. Yeah, that's right.
That's wonderful. So last question for you today, Max. Along the way, you have given us an enormous amount of great advice and lots of food to chew on as far as a career in writing and being novelist and screenwriter and so on. But I'm wondering if you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give to those who are maybe starting out in the business, like your students, or maybe they're in a little bit and trying to get to the next level.
Well, again, in terms of advice, I got all sorts of sort of little bits of advice here, there, and, but I think the best advice I could give to anybody in terms of starting out as a writer and a creative generally is to sort of listen to yourself and find out where and when you're at your best and most creative. Some people it's late at night. Some people it's first thing in the morning. I had a great colleague who told me that they always have the laptop by the side of the bed because they believe that writing and creativity is very much, you're in the dream state. And actually, if you, as soon as you wake up, rather than getting up and getting on with your day, you actually sort of use the sort of residue of that dream state for your creativity. That can work really well. So, for some people, they like a glass of whiskey. Some people like the endorphins of exercising, going for a run. For some people, they might want to smoke something or take something or whatever it might be. I don't know, but for certain people, for all of us, I think creatives, we need to listen to ourselves and our sort of subconscious and our conscious and work out when we are at our most effective and when we are at our best in terms of creativity. And then keep recreating, the zone, getting into that zone. And I think that is, the best advice that I could, give is find out when you're at your best and where you're at your best and sort of recreate that environment as much as you possibly can. Because there's nothing worse than, just trying, and we all have to do it sometimes, when we've got a deadline, sometimes you don't have the luxury of being able to choose your moment and you have to just sort of grind out the work. But I think it's very important to have an understanding of your own creativity and when you're good and when you're not.
I think that's a very, very wise advice because there are early morning writers, there are late night writers, there are people that have a certain set pattern, there are people that write whenever they feel like it. There's all kinds of different ways, and what works best for you should be something that you focus on. Yeah. Let it be best for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also think getting a cat's useful.
A cat?
A cat. Yeah.
Unless you're allergic.
Unless you're allergic, yes, in which case don't. But yeah, I always think writers and cats seem to go well together.
I fear that I am terribly allergic to cats, so I would not have a cat. A dog, yes, but not a cat.
Ah, there you go. Yeah, same thing, I'm sure. It's just nice to have that sort of different kind of mindset around, definitely. Yeah.
Max Kinnings, this has been so much fun for me, and I'm just thrilled that you've spent more than an hour with us today on StoryBeat. And I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy, your wisdom. And for those of you listening, go out and buy Hitman or The Fixer, Sacrifice or Baptism, and read Max Kinnings, because I think you'll find him to be absolutely entertaining and just a joy to read. Max, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you, Steve. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you. And keep up the good work. It's a great podcast.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.